Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fairy Tale Magazine's new series of author talks, where we bring you conversations with writers, poets, scholars, and artists who are working with fairy tale and folklore. I'm Kelly Jarvis, and today I am excited to welcome Shveta Thakrar to join me. She is a writer, a poet, and a believer in magic whose work has appeared in publications like Enchanted Living and Uncanny magazine, and whose adult fantasy novella, Into the Moon Garden, is available as an original audiobook on Audible. She is best known, however, for her young adult novels, which transport readers to the luscious world of the night market. And these include Star Daughter, which was a finalist for the 2021 Nebula Award, The Dream Runners, and of course, her upcoming release, Divining the Leaves. Welcome. We are so happy to have you joining us today on Author Talks.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'd love to begin by having you tell us a little bit about Divining the Leaves, your upcoming release. What can readers expect when they open up the cover of your beautiful new novel?
So, off the top of my head, this is my enemies to friends book because I thought we don't have enough platonic relationships in young adult between girls and boys. So I wanted there's some romance in this is not between the main characters. That's a very deliberate thing. We have a lot of lush description and an enchanted forest kingdom with yakshas and yakshinis from Hindu folklore. We have natural perfumery, which I dabbled in briefly, and a lot of court intrigue.
Yes, and it's a
And of course,
fabulous book. I had a chance to read an art copy of it, and I absolutely loved it. It is a standalone novel, but it does return readers to that luscious world of the night market. It's part of your night market triptych. Can you tell us a little bit about what inspired you to first create the night market, and why do you keep returning to this setting in your fiction?
that's a great question. I'm still looking for magic. I don't care if people say that adults stupid or childish or whatever. I think that we should be living from a place of awe and wonder and curiosity, and the idea that if you're looking through a scientific lens, the universe is a very strange and mysterious place. So who's to say that those extra things aren't out there? And if even if they're not, they can certainly live in here in my head, or in my imagination. So I've just always been entranced by the idea of magical settings and with a bit of that aren't necessarily safe, but there's very much intriguing. And when I discovered that night markets are a real thing in our world, maybe not magical, but they do exist in certain parts of Asia, I was absolutely delighted. And I'd seen various depictions of course, going back to Rosethi's Goblin Market, but just in general, so many takes on this idea of going somewhere alluring yet possibly dangerous to buy impossible things that are probably really not good for you, but how can you say no? That and so when I first wrote Star Daughter, I knew that was going to be in there. And then later, as I realized there were going to be other books in that same universe, standalones, like you said, with different bits of Hindu mythology and different characters, I thought, okay, well, it makes sense that each that they the books would all be connected by visits to this magical night market. Plus, it meant I got to write invent as many fun wares for the reader as I could think of.
It's always so exciting for me as a reader when I get to return to the night market through your works. So I really do enjoy that quality of your books. Your books do have this beautiful blend of real world settings and characters with these fantastical, magical worlds and settings. And oftentimes they are inspired, as you said, by Hindu folklore and Indian mythology, and of course, fairy tale. When you sit down to create a new piece of work, do you generally begin with some folklore and build a story around the folklore, or do you start with the real world elements and then sort of weave folklore in as you're writing?
It's a really good question. My process is very messy. I wish I had something that orderly to say, but it's more that I the way my mind works is by ideation, it will grab this thing that looks interesting, and this thing that looks interesting, this thing that looks interesting, and that can we put them all together in this big stew. I joke that I have a sparkly purple cauldron at the back of my head where everything is brewing, and eventually I'll find out that some of the ideas I had don't belong there, or I need to do them differently than I thought, or they come together in this way. So so I can't even say I really for Dividing the Leaves, I did think that okay, if we're doing one more book in this mythological universe, then an area I haven't tapped yet are the yakshas and their forest kingdom. So there was that. And I also tried to think what kind of story in our contemporary world could go with that. And the funny thing is, I originally had what turned out to be a middle grade premise, and I threw it out of somebody battling a really basically battling a developer who was trying to raise the forest. But that really is more of a middle grade sort of premise. And when I thought more about it, I realized, okay, that's not the story that I wanted to tell at all. Anyway, so for me, I have to go through various drafts to find this actual story that wants to be told. So it's a mix of everything you said.
Yeah, so lots of different layers as you're moving through the process. And that's reflected, I think, in the layers of the story at the end as the result, which is fabulous. One of the things that I truly love about your writing is your lush descriptive imagery. I absolutely adore it. And in Divining the Leaves, as you said, your main female character dabbles in creating perfumes and scents that are inspired by her interactions with the natural world and the forest realms around her. And I honestly felt like I could smell and taste the words on the page when I was reading the book. And I love that. How do you balance your aesthetic sensibilities with the pacing of your plot when you're writing? And are there any writers who help to inspire or develop your aesthetic abilities?
Let me actually tackle the second question first. I I had told stories on and off my whole life before I even really doing it seriously. And probably a lot of us do who grew up loving reading and loving fantasy and fairy tales, right? So, but it didn't occur to me until I had seen Catherine Valenti's writing and Laini Taylor's writing that that using language itself as a spell was a thing that you could do. And once I saw that, something just resonated inside me. I thought, that's my voice. I just have to work on developing it. And over time I did. And because what I want to do with all the stories I ever tell, I mean, I hope I'll write different types of fantasy. Is obviously I can't just write one thing, or I don't want to write just one thing, but I always want to make it immersive. And like I said, language as a spell itself is really, in my opinion, the way to do that. And to go to your earlier question, it's definitely a balance. And I've had to learn how to how to think what details need to be on the page and what don't, because otherwise we will get bogged down, and too much becomes overwhelming for the reader and stops becoming immersive. It just starts being opaque. And that's the last thing I want. I want to draw the reader in, not kick them out.
Beautiful. And you have a beautiful balance of those things as well. I love the layers of your fiction, both at the word level and then at the plotting level as well. It's just absolutely fabulous. Something we always like to know here at the Fairy Tale Magazine, do you have a favorite fairy tale and have you used it in any of your published fiction?
Yes and yes. So one thing that I'm glad that we are all finally starting to talk about as folklorists and lovers of fairy tales is that there are way more fairy tales or wonder tales, if we want to use that term, than the few Western ones we're used to seeing here in the especially in the Western market, right? Like I'm so thrilled that we have a whole world full what I call the global treasure troves worth. And one of my favorites is from the Mahabharata, which is the longest epic poem in the world from India, and in there's a story, one of the many, many, many stories in it, called Savitri and Satyavan. So I'll retell it really fast. Savitri was a princess, and when it was time for her to get married, her parents let her have a swayamvara, which meant that they let her choose. So a bunch of suitors, a bunch of princes came to try to win her hand, and they went through various uh, competitions of strength and wit and so on. And she picked someone named Satyavan at the end of all of this. And a sage Narad, who shows up in many of the stories, tried to warn her parents that that was a bad decision because Satyavan, though he didn't know it, was due to die in a little over a year. But so Savitri's parents tried to talk her out of it, but she refused. And she said, you told me I could choose my husband. So as sad as they were, they had to say yes. Plus, on top of the fact that Satyavan's death date was coming. His parents had lost their kingdom, they'd become impoverished, and they'd become blind and infirm. So she was going to have to go become a poor wife off in the forest, waiting on them, basically serving them. So her parents, as you can imagine, really weren't thrilled about this, but they couldn't sway her. So Savitri and Satyavan got married. They went off into the forest, and they lived simply in a hut, and she took care of her parents-in-law. She never told Satyavan that he was going to die. She just quietly kept an eye on the calendar. And when that day grew near, they went for a walk in the forest, and he started to get weaker and weaker. And finally he had to lie down and put his head in her lap, and he died. But she wasn't dismayed. She just waited. And then Lord Yama from the Hindu underworld, the Hindu hell, the god of the dead, came to claim his spirit to send it off for reincarnation. And Savitri didn't argue, she just started following them. And Lord Yama was so impressed by her devotion that he said, okay, I'm going to grant you a boon, but it cannot be the life of your husband, anything else. So very clever Savitri, who'd had a year to plan this out, said, okay, I'd like for you to return the health to my laws. So Lord Yama said, done, now leave. He walked off again with Satyavan's shade. Savitri continued to follow them. Again, Lord Yama, impressed, said, okay, I'll grant you another boon, but you cannot have the life of your husband. So she said, okay, can you return their kingdom to them that they lost? And he said, okay, done. Now leave. She followed them one more time. At this point, Lord Yama was starting to get annoyed. And he said, okay, I'll grant you one last boon, and after this, you have to leave because now you're trying my patience. And so she said, okay, I'd like to have 100 sons. But in my head, I've recanonized it. I'd like to have 100 daughters. So we'll go with that. I'd like to have 100 daughters. He said, okay. She said, how can I do that without my husband? And Lord Yama realized he'd been tricked, and he restored Satyavan to life. And they all went to live happily ever after. So I've always loved that story. I thought it was very feminist, especially if you change the 100 sons to 100 daughters thing. And I actually ended up using it in a short story along with a different tale in the anthology A Thousand Beginnings and Endings.
So you like a trickster tale and a good feminist story. And we love those things here at the Fairy Tale Magazine as well. And also love the way you can introduce readers to a whole new world of folklore and fairy tale beyond the European and the Western stories that we know. Your books really do open up that world for the reader. And I love that. Before we have to go, I would love it if you could just tell us a little bit about some new projects you're working on after readers complete Divining the Leaves, which comes out on March 4th. What can they look forward to next?
Well, I have at least one more YA coming. I haven't started it yet, so I don't want to say too much about it, but I'll just say this, it may well involve vampires from Hindu and Buddhist folklore. And I'm also working on an uncontracted adult project. So we'll see how all that goes. But
Okay, you've got us interested. Well, we just want to thank you for joining us. We appreciate having you here for our Author Talks series. Divining the Leaves does come out on March 4th, so mark your calendars for that. And we will have a review of it up on the Fairy Tale Magazine website very soon. And while you're waiting, you can visit Shveta's website to find more great works that she has written and find out more about her. So thank you so much for joining us.